So if a kid is getting in trouble at school, right, because he's so angry, that behavioral consequence is important for us to examine to see if we can work on getting them to generate alternative solutions that are better. My name is Dr. Dana Boccio. I'm an assistant professor here at Adelphi University. I teach primarily in the master's program in school psychology here at the Derner Institute. I have to say that a lot of the work that I do in the classroom is really influenced by my own experiences when I was working as a school psychologist. So if I had to explain a type of teaching model that I use, it would be theory meets practice. It's so important for students to have a strong theoretical understanding behind the techniques that they're using, especially if they're going to have to modify those techniques in the schools so that they realize that they're not violating any core principles. So I do try to teach students about ethical decision-making models that are out there, ways to go through step by step a process, a more methodical process that really kind of helps students make informed decisions that are not on a whim, that are really thought through and are thoughtful in general. One thing that I've realized through teaching is that basically role play is so important. You really want to get students to have a chance to experience some of the feelings that they might in a realistic situation. So although role plays are always a little bit contrived, they still kind of bring in some of the elements that you might experience while you're actually doing any kind of therapy session. Okay, so let's stop for a second. So first of all, I think this is excellent. This is wonderful. So what do you guys think? Any feedback? I basically have two particular areas of research that I work on. One is on suicide risk assessment and preventing suicide amongst adolescents. The other is ethical decision making and improving the ethical decisions that school psychologists arrive at. So we will role play, we'll practice certain scenarios that school psychologists face. I like to have my students role play doing a suicide risk assessment, so that's kind of how I try to tie them together a little bit. I would be interested, is there anything that you did differently or that you were telling yourself that led you to feel really good after? I think the most rewarding part for me is actually seeing how I can have an impact on the outside world through educating people who go out there and actually bring forth the knowledge that we teach them here at Adelphi. Especially when I'm working with my third-year students who are on internship and they're in the school system. You know, they write reports on what's going on, they share stories about what's happening in their schools, and when they use the techniques that we impart to them, that we give them, it's really rewarding to see them actually in action, working. So I think that's really exciting as a professor, as an educator, and I think the students get excited too by seeing that this stuff actually works. It really works, and where some of the obstacles are that now they're prepared to deal with in the future. I like when my students are creative. I encourage that. In one of my courses now, my school-based prevention course, we talk about something called social emotional learning, which is really teaching students to have those skills, those interpersonal skills and intrapersonal skills that help them function in their daily lives. So everything from emotional regulation to conflict resolution skills. So one of the assignments that I've given my students is to come up with their own activity for how to teach one of those types of skills. You know, it's really interesting and really rewarding when students are willing to share their own personal experiences with you. It makes you realize how human they are, and I think it helps them realize that you're a human too as a professor. So when a student is willing to participate in a role play activity and actually share some of the personal struggles that they're dealing with, it's a little surprising to me and yet really exciting. Their life, you know. Focusing on empiricism, the belief basically, or the idea that where's the consultation class now, and in consultation you're always working with parents, with teachers, even administrators, and discussing ways to help a third party, which is usually a student in a school. So it's so important to really practice those situations because so many different things come up. You might be working with a parent who's not happy with some recommendations that have been made for their child, or a teacher who's really working on classroom management and having trouble. So it's really great to actually practice those activities so students are more prepared. So there's always a little anxiety on the part of the therapist and also even the client or the student. So we really try to recreate that feeling actually in a mock session. So this is something that I thought would be useful in class, particularly because those feelings of anxiety can interfere with performance. And the more that you get a chance to practice what you'll actually be doing in the schools, the more prepared you really are, I think, when you actually enter the field. So that was kind of the idea behind it. I think especially at the graduate level, you're going to be entering the field in a very short period of time. So you really have to be prepared at this point for the actual interpersonal interactions, many of which are challenging in the schools. So without doing role plays and encouraging assignments where students actually go out there, meet with teachers, meet with parents, and really interact, we're not going to prepare our students well for the work that they have to do. Like to actually practice these techniques. So there's clearly a development in undergraduate education where you learn about the theory and you learn about maybe some practical applications, but in graduate school you kind of tie it all together and you really have more actual practice, which I think really is important for preparing students for the real world. I actually teach several different practical-based courses, and that was actually clinical interventions in the schools. And the purpose of that course, it's an upper-level course, it's for our third years. It's really to introduce students to different interventions that are empirically based that we tend to use in the schools with children with different difficulties. So learning difficulties, ADHD, depression, anxiety, just different techniques that can be used to really help students adjust in school. And that day I was actually introducing students to a theoretical framework called cognitive behavior therapy, which really holds that if you change people's beliefs, if you take their maladaptive or irrational beliefs and you change them to be a little bit more positive, a little more realistic, you actually have an impact on their feelings and even their behavior. So maybe situations that upset them before, now they can handle a little bit better, and things they used to avoid, maybe they'll approach more. So in that particular class, we also did a role play activity. And two of my students were kind enough to volunteer to participate. One was the therapist, one was the particular student who had some self-confidence issues, and she was really struggling with her sense of self and her confidence level. So we actually role-played some of the CBT techniques that I was teaching in class. And they share them with the class, so everyone kind of gets ideas as to what they could do in the classroom. And it's really kind of exciting, and it's a way to get them to think outside of the box and not just look in the literature and read what's out there, but create something new, create something that they came up with on their own. Well, I would say that my research interests really stem from personal experiences, particularly in my early career. One thing that I noticed with respect to suicide was that when I was a practicing school psychologist, I felt woefully inadequately trained to deal with students who came in and were potentially at risk for killing themselves. It's such a topic that's almost taboo that people don't talk about enough. And in my graduate training, it was covered in maybe 15 minutes. So I realized I had to educate myself, and that learning doesn't end when you leave graduate school, and in some ways it's just beginning. So I did my own research, I looked into the literature, I looked into what was out there, and I gradually became more confident and more comfortable in the decisions and the judgments that I was making. But it almost became my passion then in academia to make sure that my students are not facing that same level of poor preparedness when they go into the field. So I want to make sure that when they actually are practicing, it's not, the first time that they've talked about suicide when they have a student in their office. And this is something that they feel, still a little anxious about, which is important, I suppose, but not unprepared to deal with. And with respect to ethics, I would say it's similar issues. When I was a school psychologist, I faced some serious ethical dilemmas, and I was really torn as to how to handle them. So I would like to get my students at least thinking about what could potentially happen, beyond studying the ethical codes that are out there. When they conflict, what do you do? Where's the guidance? How do you handle those things? So I would have to say that my teaching is so strongly influenced by my experiences and by my practical work that I would like to prepare students for the areas that I felt, I could have had more training in, I think.